All right, I've had enough of this. You're under arrest.
Under arrest for what?
For what? For obstruction. Now put your hands behind your back.
This time I'm not asking! Deputy, I strongly advise against that.
The heat in West Texas wasn't just a temperature, it was a physical presence. It pressed down from a bleached white sky, radiated up from the cracked asphalt of Highway 285, and shimmered in waves that distorted the horizon into a watery mirage. This was the kingdom of Deputy Travis Miller, and the heat was the only thing he respected. At 36, Miller was already starting to look like the landscape, weathered, cracked around the edges, and perpetually baked in a state of simmering resentment. His uniform, a shade of tan that mirrored the dust, was always a size too tight across his chest and shoulders, a constant reminder of the high school football star he used to be. Now the muscle had softened into a solid gut that strained against his duty belt, a belt that carried the weight of a Glock 22, a taser, and the crushing burden of his own insignificance. For 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, Miller's throne was the worn driver's seat of his Ford Police Interceptor. He'd park in the shade of a lonely mesquite tree, the engine rumbling to keep the air conditioning blasting, and watch the world pass him by. He watched oil tankers and cattle trucks, families in minivans on their way to Big Bend, and college kids in beat-up Hondas. They were all just ghosts, transient figures in a life that felt stuck in park. He had joined the Culberson County Sheriff's Department a decade ago with vague notions of heroism, of high-speed chases and dramatic standoffs. The reality was speeding tickets, domestic disputes fueled by cheap beer, and the endless, monotonous heat. It had curdled him, turning his ambition into a low-grade, constant anger that needed a place to go. He despised outsiders, not just because they weren't from around here, but because they represented a life he felt cheated out of. Their new cars, their easy laughter, their destinations. It all felt like a personal insult. His authority, the badge on his chest and the lights on his roof, was his only defense against that feeling. Out here on these sun-scorched miles of nothing, he wasn't just a deputy, he was the gatekeeper, he was the law. He could make people feel as small and powerless as he felt everywhere else. It was a potent drug, and Miller was a deep-seated addict. That's when he saw it. A silver Honda Accord, maybe 4 or 5 years old. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't speeding. In fact, it was traveling at precisely the 75-mile-per-hour speed limit, its driver holding a steady line in the right lane. But to Travis Miller, its very normalcy was a provocation. It was clean, for one thing. The silver paint gleamed under the oppressive sun, suggesting it had recently been washed. The windows were tinted, but not illegally so. He could just make out 2 silhouettes inside. They were just driving, minding their own business, and that was the problem. They were in his office, and they hadn't checked in with the boss. He squinted, leaning forward. As the car drew parallel to his hiding spot, a sliver of untinted windshield gave him a clearer view. The driver was a black man, wearing a light-colored polo shirt. Beside him, a black woman, her hair tied back, looked down at her lap, probably at a phone. The man had one hand on the wheel, a picture of relaxed control. It was the kind of calm that Miller interpreted as arrogance. It was the same territorial instinct that made a coyote bristle at the sight of a hawk circling overhead. They didn't belong here. That was the thought, immediate and absolute, that formed in his gut. They were too clean, too calm, too out of place. It was a feeling, a gut instinct, and in Culberson County, Travis Miller's gut had the full force of law. He didn't need a reason. He could always invent one later. Failure to maintain a single lane, an obstructed license plate, a brake light that flickered just so. He hadn't seen any of those things, but he knew he could make himself believe he had. He shifted the cruiser into drive. The tires crunched on the gravel shoulder as he pulled out onto the highway, the powerful engine roaring to life, a predator beginning its hunt. He didn't turn on the lights yet. He wanted to follow for a minute, to let them see him in their rearview mirror. He wanted them to feel that cold knot of anxiety in their stomachs, the one that asks, What did I do wrong? He closed the distance until his front bumper was just a car length from their back one, a silent, menacing presence. He saw the driver's head adjust slightly, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. Good. He sees me. The show was about to begin. The silver Accord continued its placid journey unperturbed. The driver didn't speed up. He didn't slow down. He didn't swerve. He just kept driving, a model of civic perfection. This, more than anything, cemented Miller's suspicion. It was a performance. Innocent people got nervous. They tapped their brakes, drifted a little. This guy was too cool, too collected. It was the composure of someone who had practiced this before, someone who had something to hide and knew the rules of the game. Miller's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The anger he felt simmering all morning began to bubble. He was being challenged, his authority tested by this man's refusal to be intimidated. "All right, playtime's over," Miller muttered to the empty passenger seat. He flicked a switch on the console. The world behind the Accord erupted in a silent explosion of red and blue light, strobing against the blinding Texas sun. He added a quick, authoritative chirp from the siren, just enough to make them jump. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the Accord's right turn signal began to blink, a calm, rhythmic pulse. The car glided smoothly onto the wide, dusty shoulder and came to a gentle stop. There was no sudden lurch, no panicked braking. It was the kind of textbook pullover that infuriated Miller to his core. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is 4-David-30, showing one stopped, Highway 285, mile marker 112. His voice was flat, professional. It was the voice he used for the official record. The voice in his head was something else entirely. "Let's see what we got here. Probably running drugs from El Paso. Or maybe they got warrants. Yeah, I bet they got warrants." He was already constructing the narrative, a story where he was the hero, the vigilant guardian sniffing out crime where others saw only an ordinary car. The dispatcher, a woman named Dolores with a voice as dry as the desert floor, crackled back. 10-4, 4-David-30, silver Honda, Texas plates? "That's affirmative," Miller said, even as he was typing the plate number into his onboard computer. He didn't wait for the result. The computer was slow, and besides, he preferred to work on his own instincts. The results would only tell him who the car was registered to. They wouldn't tell him what was really going on. He put the cruiser in park, the engine's rumble a comforting sound. He took a moment, a ritual he performed before every stop. He adjusted his belt, felt the reassuring weight of his sidearm, and took a deep, steadying breath. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was an instrument of the law, a vessel of pure, unquestionable authority. He opened his door, stepping out into the oppressive heat. The air was thick and smelled of hot asphalt and diesel fumes from a passing truck. He left his own door open, a standard tactical procedure, and began the slow, deliberate walk toward the Accord. He stayed wide of the car, his eyes scanning everything. The trunk, the back seat, the hands of the occupants. He saw the driver's hands were already on the steering wheel, at the 10 and 2 position, just like they taught in driving school. The woman in the passenger seat was now looking forward, her hands folded in her lap. More practiced compliance. His contempt grew with every step. He decided to approach on the passenger side. It was a power move. It forced the driver to turn and look at him, putting them off balance. It also gave him a better view of the entire car's interior. He planted his feet just behind the passenger door, his left hand resting casually on his gun belt. He rapped his knuckles sharply on the window. The sound was loud in the sudden quiet, punctuated only by the distant hum of cicadas. The window slid down with a silent electronic whir, releasing a blast of cold, conditioned air that felt like an affront to the blistering heat of his world. The woman inside turned to look at him. She was elegant, professional, wearing a simple but well-cut blouse. Her expression wasn't fear, it was a mild, questioning annoyance, the look you might give a waiter who brought the wrong order. And that, Travis Miller decided, was the last straw. "Afternoon, folks," Miller began, his voice a lazy West Texas drawl he thickened for effect. It was his good old boy persona, a mask of folksy charm that barely concealed the steel beneath. He leaned down, resting a forearm on the roof of the car, deliberately invading their personal space. He peered past the woman to get a better look at the driver. The man was in his early 40s, with a neat, trimmed beard and intelligent eyes behind a pair of conservative glasses. He wore a crisp, gray polo shirt and khaki pants. He looked more like a college professor than a drug runner, which, in Miller's mind, made him even more suspicious. They were trying too hard. "Is there a problem, officer?" the woman asked. Her voice was as cool and crisp as the air coming from the car's vents. There was no fear in it, just a direct, clear inquiry. It lacked the deference he expected, the slight tremble of anxiety he was used to hearing. Miller ignored her, keeping his eyes fixed on the driver. "License and registration, please," he said, his tone flat. It wasn't a request. The driver, Marcus, met his gaze in the rearview mirror before turning his head slightly. His movements were economical and calm. "Certainly, officer. May I ask why we were pulled over?" The question was polite, but it was a challenge, a direct challenge to his authority. Miller felt a hot flash of anger. Civilians didn't ask questions. They complied. "You failed to maintain a single lane back there a ways," he lied, the words flowing effortlessly. "Looked like you were weaving a bit. Just want to make sure everything's all right, that you're not too tired to be driving." Marcus's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. "Weaving? Officer, I have the cruise control set and I haven't left this lane for 50 miles. "Well, that's not what I saw," Miller snapped back, letting the folksy charm drop. "Now, are you going to give me your license or are we going to have a problem?" Beside him, the woman, Lena, placed a gentle hand on her husband's arm. "Marcus, just give it to him." Her voice was quiet, but it carried an authority of its own. It was a strategic retreat, not a surrender. Marcus gave a small nod. "Of course." He turned to reach for the glove compartment. "Whoa, hold on there, son," Miller said, his hand dropping from the roof to rest on the butt of his Glock. "Let me see your hands, both of you. Keep 'em where I can see 'em." Marcus froze, his hand hovering over the dashboard. He slowly raised both hands and placed them back on the steering wheel. "Officer, my wallet and the vehicle's registration are in the glove compartment. You asked for them. I am now reaching for them." He spoke each word with deliberate, almost painful clarity, as if explaining a complex concept to a small child. The condescension, real or imagined, was like gasoline on a fire for Miller. "You reach when I tell you to reach, you get me? I don't know what you got in there. Could be anything." He was building his case, layering the audio for the dash cam. Suspect made furtive movements, non-compliant with commands. "There is nothing in this vehicle that is a threat to you, officer," Lena said, her voice still unnervingly calm. "We are on our way to a family event in Fort Stockton." "I don't care if you're on your way to see the president," Miller retorted, his face reddening under his tan. "Right now you're on the side of my highway, and you're going to do exactly what I say. Now, driver, step out of the car. Slowly." A silent conversation passed between Marcus and Lena. It was a glance, a flicker of understanding that lasted no more than a second. It was the communication of two people who had faced far worse than a belligerent deputy on a lonely road. Marcus let out a slow, controlled breath. "As you wish, officer," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. He reached for the door handle. Miller took a step back, creating space, his hand now firmly gripping his weapon. He felt a surge of triumph. The calm was finally breaking. He was in control. He was winning. The driver's door opened with a soft click, and Marcus swung his legs out onto the gravel shoulder. He was taller than Miller had expected, with the lean, solid build of a man who took care of himself. He moved with a certain economy of motion, a quiet confidence that Miller found deeply irritating. As Marcus stood up, shielding his eyes from the relentless sun, he looked Miller squarely in the eye. There was no fear there. There was no anger. There was just assessment. It felt like the deputy was the one being evaluated, and it set his teeth on edge. "Turn around, face the car," Miller commanded, his voice harsher than he intended. Marcus complied without a word, turning to face the silver sedan. He placed his hands on the roof, the metal already hot enough to be uncomfortable. He stood there, a picture of passive resistance, his gray polo shirt and khaki pants looking utterly out of place against the backdrop of dust and scrub brush. Miller approached him from behind, relishing the dominant position. "I asked you where you were headed," he said, his voice close to Marcus's ear. "I believe my wife already answered that, officer. A family event in Fort Stockton." "What kind of family event?" Miller pressed, his questions becoming more intrusive. He wasn't looking for information. He was looking for a crack in the facade, a slip-up, a hint of deception he could exploit. "A birthday party for my uncle," Marcus answered, his voice still maddeningly even. "An uncle, huh? What's his name?" "His name is George." "George what?" Marcus paused for a fraction of a second. "Officer, is this line of questioning relevant to the traffic violation you claim to have witnessed?" That was it. The second direct challenge. The calm, logical questioning of his authority was something Miller couldn't tolerate. It was time to escalate, to change the rules of the game. He took a theatrical sniff of the air around the open car door. "You know what?" Miller said, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. "I think I smell marijuana." It was the oldest trick in the book, a lie so common it was almost a cliché. It was also legally powerful. The supposed smell of contraband gave him probable cause, a key that could unlock the car, the trunk, and the dignity of its occupants. From inside the car, Lena's head snapped up. "Officer, that is a blatant falsehood," she said, her voice losing its cool edge for the first time, replaced by a note of sharp, indignant steel. "Neither of us uses drugs, and there is absolutely no marijuana in this vehicle. You know that." "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stay quiet," Miller said, not even looking at her. His focus was entirely on the man in front of him. "Your husband here is being detained as part of a narcotics investigation. Now, based on the odor of marijuana coming from your vehicle, I have probable cause to search this car and everyone in it." He let the words hang in the hot, still air. He had them. He had fabricated a reason, and now the law, as he chose to interpret it, was on his side. Marcus remained silent, his hands still flat on the roof of the car. But Miller could see the muscles in his back tense beneath his shirt. The deputy felt another surge of victory. He had found the crack. He had introduced a new level of threat, and the man's composure was finally starting to crumble. "So, we're going to do this again," Miller said, his voice dripping with false patience. "Where are you coming from today?" "El Paso," Marcus said, his voice tight. "El Paso," Miller repeated, drawing the words out. "That's a big-time border town, ain't it? Lots of stuff comes across that border. You wouldn't be bringing anything back with you from El Paso, would you, Marcus?" He had intentionally not asked for the man's name yet, but used it as if he already knew it, a subtle psychological jab to unsettle him. A beat of silence. "My name is on my driver's license, which you haven't yet asked to see," Marcus said, his voice dangerously low. "And you will not search my vehicle or my person without a warrant." Miller laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Son, I am the warrant." With the magic words probable cause now hanging in the air, blessed by his own false witness, Miller felt emboldened. The roadside was his stage, the dashcam his audience, and he was the star of this show. He was going to break this man down, piece by piece, right here on the sun-scorched gravel. He needed to establish a clear narrative for the recording, a non-compliant suspect, a dangerous situation, a deputy forced to take firm action. "I'm going to have to pat you down for officer safety," Miller declared, his voice taking on a formal, procedural tone for the camera. "Given the smell of narcotics, I have reason to believe you may be armed." He moved closer, his presence looming over Marcus. The heat radiating off the car and the asphalt was suffocating. Sweat was beading on Miller's forehead and trickling down his temples, but he barely noticed. Adrenaline was a far more powerful force than the sun. He saw his own reflection in the car's tinted window, a solid, imposing figure of the law standing over a suspect. He liked what he saw. "Am I under arrest, officer?" Marcus asked, his head still facing forward. "You're being detained," Miller spat back. "There's a difference. Now put your hands behind your back. Interlace your fingers." Marcus didn't move immediately. "On what grounds am I being detained? And for how long?" "You're being detained on suspicion of narcotics trafficking. Now, are you going to comply, or am I going to have to make you comply?" Miller's voice rose, a calculated burst of aggression for the microphone on his vest. He wanted this to sound like a confrontation, like he was dealing with a resistant, dangerous criminal. Slowly, Marcus brought his hands down from the roof and placed them behind his back. The movement was deliberate, not subservient. It was the action of a man choosing to comply, not one being forced to. Miller grabbed his wrists roughly. They were thick and solid. He began his pat-down, his hands moving with an unprofessional, invasive aggression. He slapped Marcus's pockets, squeezed his thighs, ran his hands up his torso. He was looking for the telltale bulge of a weapon or the crinkle of a bag of drugs. He found nothing but a wallet in the back right pocket and a phone in the front. He pulled the wallet out. It was a simple black leather bifold, nothing fancy. "What's in here?" he grunted, holding it up as if it were contraband. "My identification," Marcus said. "The very thing you asked for 10 minutes ago." Miller ignored him, tossing the wallet onto the hood of the Accord. He continued his search, his frustration growing with every fruitless pat. The man was clean. There was no weapon. There were no drugs. The facade of his probable cause was starting to feel thin, even to him. He needed something more. He needed to provoke a physical reaction. He kicked Marcus's feet further apart. "Wider!" he barked. Marcus adjusted his stance, his shoes scraping on the loose gravel. "I said wider!" Miller shouted, kicking his right foot again, harder this time. From the car, Lena's voice rang out, sharp and clear. "Officer, you are now committing assault. Your actions are being recorded, not just by your own vehicle, but by ours as well." Miller froze, his hand hovering over Marcus's back. He glanced toward the Accord's windshield. He couldn't see a camera, but that didn't mean one wasn't there. The thought that he was being recorded by them, that his performance was being judged by another unseen audience, sent a jolt of fury through him. These people were prepared, they were smart, and he hated them for it. He stepped back from Marcus, his mind racing. The pat-down was a bust. The interrogation was going nowhere. His authority was being chipped away with every calm, legally precise statement they made. He was losing control of the scene, of his own narrative. He had to regain the upper hand. He had to get inside the car. The lie about the marijuana smell was his only key, and he was going to use it. "You stay right there," he snarled at Marcus, pointing a thick finger at him. "Don't you move a muscle." He turned and walked back toward the open driver's side door, a new sense of purpose in his stride. He was going to tear their clean, cool, arrogant little world apart. As Miller reached the driver's door, intent on beginning his probable cause search, Lena's voice stopped him cold. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the oppressive heat with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Officer, I'm formally notifying you that you do not have our consent to enter this vehicle," she said. "Your claim of smelling marijuana is pretextual and made in bad faith. Any evidence you pretend to find will be the fruit of a poisonous tree. I'm sure you're familiar with the legal doctrine." Miller's hand froze on the doorframe. Fruit of a poisonous tree? Where did a woman like this learn a phrase like that? He turned slowly, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. She was sitting there, perfectly composed, looking at him over the top of her sunglasses. She wasn't just a passenger. She was a barricade, one built of laws and statutes he only vaguely understood. He had expected tears or pleading. Instead, he was getting a free legal seminar. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl as he walked back towards the passenger window. "You seem to know a lot of $10 words. Are you a lawyer or something?" "My profession is not relevant," Lena replied, her gaze unwavering. "The Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution is, you have no warrant, you have no legitimate probable cause, and you have no consent. If you proceed, you are acting outside the color of law." Every word was a nail in the coffin of his authority. She was dismantling his power, citation by citation, in front of the man he had standing on the hot asphalt. The humiliation was a physical thing, a burning sensation in his chest. The dashcam was recording all of this, his every action being dissected and challenged. He had to shut her down. "You know what I think?" he sneered, leaning down again, his face inches from hers. "I think you're interfering with a police investigation. That's a crime in the state of Texas. You keep talking and you'll be joining your husband on the hood." "Citing my constitutional rights is not interference, officer," Lena said, not flinching from his proximity. "It is my right. And threatening me for exercising it is a separate and distinct violation of my civil liberties under Title 18, Section 242 of the U.S. Code." He stared at her, dumbfounded. She was quoting federal statutes. Who were these people? The initial narrative, drug runners from the border, was dissolving into something he didn't understand, something far more complicated and dangerous. His simple world of gut feelings and roadside dominance was being invaded by a foreign language of codes and amendments. Fear, for the first time, began to prickle at the edges of his anger. What if he was wrong? The thought was so alien, so unwelcome, that he rejected it with violence. He straightened up, his face set like concrete. He had gone too far to back down now. To retreat would be to admit defeat, to concede that they were right and he was wrong. His ego, his very sense of self, couldn't handle it. He had crossed the Rubicon. There was no turning back. He turned his back on Lena, a deliberate act of dismissal. He walked back to Marcus, who had remained perfectly still throughout the exchange, a silent witness to his wife's defense. Miller's mind was made up. He couldn't win the legal argument. He didn't have the evidence. So he would do what he always did when his authority was challenged. He would use force. He would create a new crime, one he could control. "All right, I've had enough of this," he announced to the sky, to the camera, to the world. "You're under arrest." "Under arrest for what?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. "For what?" Miller laughed, the sound brittle and humorless. "For obstruction of justice, for resisting. Take your pick. Now put your hands behind your back. This time I'm not asking." He reached for his hip, his fingers closing around the cold, hard steel of his handcuffs. The click of the ratchet as he pulled them from their pouch was the loudest sound in the world. The sun glinted off the nickel-plated finish of the handcuffs as Miller swung them forward. This was his ace in the hole, the ultimate trump card. Words could be argued, laws could be debated, but the cold, unyielding bite of steel on wrist was absolute. It was the physical manifestation of his power, a symbol that ended all discussion. He was no longer just a man in a tan uniform, he was the state, and he was about to impose its will. "I'm telling you one last time," Miller said, his voice low and tight with adrenaline. "Put your hands behind your back, now." He stepped closer, ready to force Marcus's arms back, ready for the struggle he now craved. A physical confrontation would simplify everything. It would erase the confusing complexity of constitutional law and federal statutes, replacing it with the simple, satisfying calculus of force. Marcus did not turn around. He did not put his hands behind his back. Instead, in a voice that was utterly devoid of panic, a voice of pure, chilling calm, he said, "Deputy, I strongly advise against that." The words and the tone in which they were delivered were so unexpected that Miller actually paused. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of finality a pilot might use to announce an imminent crash. There was a profound and terrifying certainty in those words. For a split second, a sliver of doubt pierced Miller's armor of rage. But it was too late. His pride was committed. "Oh, you're advising me now?" Miller scoffed, recovering his bravado. "That's rich. You're in no position to advise anyone of anything." He reached out to grab Marcus's shoulder, to spin him around and slam him against the car. But before his fingers could make contact, Marcus began to move. It wasn't a sudden or aggressive motion. He simply lowered his hands from the roof and turned around slowly, with the unhurried grace of a man who was completely in control of the situation. He faced Miller, his expression unreadable, and held up his hands, palms open, in a gesture of peace. "Officer, you are making a mistake that will have catastrophic consequences for your career and your life," Marcus said, his voice still low, but now carrying an immense weight. "Before you proceed, you have a right to know exactly what that mistake is." Miller was momentarily stunned by the sheer audacity. The man he was about to arrest was lecturing him about his own rights. "You don't tell me about my rights," he yelled, his voice cracking. "You lost all your rights the second you decided to obstruct my investigation." "I'm not obstructing," Marcus replied. "I'm de-escalating. I am going to reach into my back right pocket, the one you already searched, and retrieve my wallet. The wallet you threw on the hood of my car. I will then open it and show you my identification. Is that clear?" He didn't wait for an answer. His movements were slow, deliberate, and broadcasted. He reached back, his fingers closing around the black leather wallet. He brought it forward, holding it in front of his chest with both hands. Miller watched, his own hand hovering over his holstered Glock, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every instinct screamed that this was a trick, a diversion. But he was also transfixed, caught in the undertow of the man's inexplicable confidence. Marcus didn't flip the wallet open to a driver's license. He didn't show a credit card or a business card. With his thumb, he pushed up a section of the leather, revealing not a plastic ID, but a small, heavy, gold-colored medallion, intricately carved and set flush into the wallet itself. The Texas sun caught the polished eagle at its crest, making it flare with a blinding light. Miller squinted, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. It was a badge. But it wasn't any kind of badge he had ever seen before. It was heavy, detailed, and radiated an aura of immense, undeniable power. Time seemed to slow down. The buzz of the cicadas faded into a dull roar in Miller's ears. The oppressive heat on his skin was replaced by an icy chill that started at the base of his spine and shot up to his skull. He stared at the object in Marcus's wallet, his mind refusing to accept the information his eyes were sending it. The gold was deep and lustrous, not the cheap plating of a novelty badge. An eagle with outstretched wings perched atop a shield. Around the central seal, engraved in sharp, definitive blue enamel, were words that hammered into his consciousness like nails into a coffin. Department of Justice, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Beneath that, on a small, polished plate, Special Agent. Miller's breath caught in his throat. He felt a wave of dizziness, and the shimmering horizon seemed to tilt violently. "No, it's a fake. A high-quality fake. These guys are professionals." That was the only possible explanation, the only narrative that allowed his world to remain intact. "That's a real nice piece of work," Miller managed to say, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Where'd you get it? Online?" Marcus's expression didn't change. The unnerving calm remained. "Next to the badge is my credential," he said, his voice a flat, emotionless instrument of truth. He used his other thumb to slide a laminated card into view from behind a plastic window. Miller's eyes flickered to the ID card. The photograph matched the man standing in front of him perfectly. The name read, Marcus Thorne. And below the name, a title that made the blood drain from Miller's face. Supervisory Special Agent. The card was holographic, crisscrossed with watermarks and embedded with a microchip. It was more complex and secure than his own driver's license. It was undeniably, terrifyingly real. The world Travis Miller had constructed for himself, his kingdom of asphalt, his authority, his gut feelings, shattered into a million pieces. The silver Honda was no longer a suspicious vehicle. The polite, well-dressed black man was no longer a potential drug runner. He was a federal agent, a high-ranking one. And Miller, with his manufactured probable cause and his escalating aggression, had just attempted to arrest him on the side of a highway in the middle of nowhere. The full, catastrophic weight of his actions crashed down on him. The illegal stop, the false pretext, the unlawful detention, the assault. It all flashed before his eyes, not as acts of dominance, but as a list of federal crimes. His federal crimes. His hand, which had been hovering over his gun, now felt impossibly heavy. He let it drop to his side. The handcuffs, still dangling from his other hand, suddenly seemed like a prop from a tragedy. He looked up from the badge to meet Marcus's eyes. The assessment he had seen there before was now gone, replaced by something far worse, a profound, clinical pity. It was the look a doctor might give a patient with a terminal diagnosis. From inside the car, the passenger door opened. Lena stepped out, her movements as fluid and confident as her husband's. She held a phone in her hand, the screen dark. She walked around the front of the car and stood beside Marcus. She looked at Miller, her expression one of cold, righteous fury. "For the record, Deputy," she said, her voice ringing in the sudden dead silence, "the entire encounter, from the moment you began tailing us, has been recorded on 3 separate devices. The audio from your vest microphone is being live-streamed to a secure federal server. My name is Dr. Lena Thorne. I am a senior analyst for the Department of Justice, and you, Deputy Miller, are in a world of trouble you cannot possibly comprehend." Miller's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His legs felt weak, and he took an involuntary step back, stumbling on the loose gravel. He had picked a fight, not with an outsider, but with the very system he had sworn to uphold. He hadn't just pulled over a car, he had declared war on the federal government of the United States. The bravado that had been Travis Miller's armor for his entire career evaporated under the Texas sun, leaving him exposed and shaking. The carefully constructed persona, the tough, no-nonsense cop who trusted his gut, crumbled to dust, revealing the scared, insecure man underneath. He looked from the golden badge back to the unyielding faces of Marcus and Lena Thorne. His mind was a frantic scramble of denial and panic. This had to be a bluff, an incredibly elaborate scam. But the authenticity of the credentials, the chilling confidence in their eyes, and the mention of a live-streamed feed to a federal server told a different, horrifying story. You can't be," he stammered, the words catching in his dry throat. "I can't be what, Deputy?" Marcus asked, his voice now taking on a new quality. The politeness was gone, stripped away to reveal the hard, unyielding authority of a man accustomed to command. "A black man driving a Honda Accord? Or a federal agent?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Let me be very clear about what has just transpired. You initiated a traffic stop without probable cause, a violation of the Fourth Amendment. You fabricated a pretext for that stop, which constitutes filing a false report. You ordered me from my vehicle under false pretenses and conducted an unlawful search of my person. You then invented another, more serious pretext, the smell of narcotics, to justify a search of my vehicle, a blatant act of perjury." Marcus took a step forward. Miller flinched and took a step back. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted with breathtaking speed. "You committed assault when you kicked my feet apart," Marcus continued, his voice like chipping ice. "And you attempted to unlawfully arrest a federal officer engaged in the performance of his duties. All of which, Deputy Miller, was motivated by a clear and demonstrable racial bias. You have violated not only departmental policy and state law, but multiple federal statutes, most notably Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code, deprivation of rights under color of law. Each violation carries a penalty of up to 10 years in a federal prison. I count at least 5 separate violations. How about you, Lena?" Lena, who had been observing Miller with the detached focus of a scientist studying a specimen, gave a curt nod. "At least 5, Marcus, and that's before we address the threats made against me when I attempted to assert our constitutional rights. That could be construed as witness tampering." Miller felt like he was drowning. The air was thick and heavy, and he couldn't seem to draw a full breath. He looked down at the handcuffs still dangling from his fingers. They looked alien, a tool of a trade he no longer felt a part of. He fumbled to clip them back onto his belt, his fingers clumsy and numb. I was just doing my job, he pleaded, the excuse sounding pathetic even to his own ears. You looked suspicious. Suspicious? Lena's voice was sharp. Suspicious of what exactly? Driving the speed limit? Having a clean car? Being black in West Texas? I want you to articulate for the record that is still streaming what specific observable facts led to your suspicion. Miller couldn't answer. There were no facts. There was only the ugly, amorphous prejudice in his gut, a feeling he had trusted his whole life. Now, exposed to the harsh light of scrutiny, it looked like what it was, a cheap and tawdry foundation for a career built on bullying. His entire professional life was a house of cards, and someone had just kicked out the table. He looked past the thorns, down the long, empty stretch of highway, as if searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to run. The kingdom he had ruled just minutes ago had become his cage. He was trapped out here with the consequences of his own actions, and he was beginning to realize that the full weight of those consequences had not yet even begun to arrive. As the full scope of his disaster settled upon him, Travis Miller's mind fixated on a single, desperate hope: backup. If he could just get his sergeant or Sheriff Bodine himself out here, they could sort this out. Bodine was a master of making things go away. He'd smooth it over, maybe crack a few jokes, and these federal agents would go on their way with a warning. It was a flimsy hope, but it was all he had. He reached instinctively for the radio on his shoulder. "Don't," Marcus said. The single word carried so much force that Miller's hand froze in midair. "You've made enough calls for one day, Deputy. It's my turn." Marcus turned away from Miller, presenting his back to him in a gesture of such complete dismissal that it was more insulting than any slur. He wasn't a threat. He was an irrelevance. Marcus pulled a second phone from his other pocket. This one was different. It was thicker, encased in heavy-duty black rubber with a short, stubby antenna, a satellite phone. He pressed a single button on its side. Miller watched, mesmerized with a growing sense of dread. This was no longer a traffic stop gone wrong. This was something else, something far outside his experience. This was a glimpse into a world of coordinated, high-level operations that he couldn't begin to fathom. The sat phone didn't ring. It simply connected. "Thorne," Marcus said into the receiver. His voice was all business. "Execute containment. I say again, execute containment protocol. Location is marker 112, Highway 285 northbound. The package is hostile but secure." There was a pause as he listened. Miller could hear a faint, tinny voice squawking from the earpiece. "Affirmative," Marcus continued. "Local LEO is compromised. One deputy on scene. Consider him a hostile actor. I want a full perimeter established. No inbound or outbound traffic, civilian or official, without my express authorization. We are dark to local dispatch. EDA?" Another pause. "Understood. Thorne out." He clicked the phone off and slid it back into his pocket. He turned back to face Miller. The deputy's face had gone pale, a sickly white shade under his tan. "Package is hostile. Local LEO is compromised. Hostile actor." Those were the terms used to describe an enemy, a target. He had just been designated the enemy. What did you do?" Miller stammered. "Who was that?" "That was my team," Marcus said simply. "They were holding a few miles back, waiting for me to clear the area. Your little stunt has changed the plan." "Team? What team?" Miller's voice was rising, bordering on hysteria. "There's no task force out here. I'd know about it." Lena let out a short, mirthless laugh. "Oh, Deputy, you really have no idea, do you? You think this was a random drive? A family trip? You think we just happened to be on your stretch of road today?" She shook her head, a look of pity on her face. "You weren't the target, but you managed to walk right into the middle of the gunfight. You're not the predator here, Deputy Miller. You're just the noisy rabbit that stumbled into the tiger's trap." Before Miller could even process the terrifying implication of her words, he heard it. It wasn't the distant wail of a siren, the familiar sound of his world. It was a low, guttural rumble, the sound of multiple powerful engines moving at high speed. He looked down the highway in the direction the Thornes had been traveling. His eyes widened. Over a rise in the road, two vehicles appeared, then a third. They were large, black SUVs with no markings and heavily tinted windows. They weren't driving in the lane, they were fanned out, taking up the entire highway, moving with the terrifying, synchronized precision of a predator pack. They were closing the distance with incredible speed, eating up the asphalt, a storm of black steel and dark glass bearing down on them. They were coming for him. The approach of the black SUVs was an exercise in terrifying efficiency. They didn't use sirens or lights. They didn't need to. Their sheer presence was enough to clear the road of the sparse traffic, which swerved onto the shoulder to get out of their way. They slowed as they neared the scene, peeling off in a synchronized maneuver. One pulled up 50 yards behind Miller's cruiser, blocking the highway. The second did the same 50 yards ahead of the Honda, cutting off any escape. The third, a massive Chevy Suburban, glided to a stop directly alongside them, its engine a low, menacing rumble. There was no hesitation. The doors of the Suburban flew open before it had even come to a complete halt. 4 men emerged, moving with a fluid, economical grace that spoke of endless training. They were dressed in black tactical gear, their faces impassive, their eyes hidden behind ballistic sunglasses. They carried short-barreled rifles, holding them in a low ready position, muzzles pointed at the ground but ready to snap up in an instant. They didn't look at Miller. To them, he was part of the scenery, an obstacle to be ignored. Their focus was entirely on Marcus and Lena. One of the agents, clearly the team lead, approached Marcus. "Sir, ma'am, are you secure?" His voice was calm, professional. "We're secure, Mike," Marcus replied, his own tone shifting back to that of a commander. "The situation is contained. This is Deputy Travis Miller of the Culberson County Sheriff's Department. He is the compromised LEO." The agent named Mike gave Miller a brief, dismissive glance, his eyes lingering for a moment on the handcuffs on Miller's belt before turning back to Marcus. "Do you want him disarmed and secured, sir?" Miller's blood ran cold. The casual way the agent asked about disarming him, as if he were taking a toy from a child, was the ultimate humiliation. Marcus considered it for a moment. "No, leave him be for now. I want him to see this." He then looked directly at Miller, his eyes hard as flint. "Deputy, I suggest you put your hands on the hood of your cruiser and do not move. If you so much as flinch, my team will interpret it as a hostile act. And trust me when I tell you their interpretation is much faster and more final than yours." Numbly, his mind unable to offer any resistance, Miller turned and walked a few steps to his patrol car. He placed his hands on the hood, the metal searingly hot under his palms. He felt the gazes of the tactical team on his back, a heavy physical weight. He was a prisoner at his own traffic stop. From this new vantage point, he watched as another figure stepped out of the Suburban. It was a woman in a crisp, dark business suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun. She carried a tablet and moved with an air of brisk, no-nonsense authority. She conferred quietly with Marcus and Lena, her eyes occasionally flicking over to Miller with undisguised contempt. The scene had been transformed in less than 2 minutes. The lonely stretch of highway was now a federal staging area. The air crackled with the quiet competence of the agents as they established their perimeter. One of them placed a small magnetic device on the roof of Miller's cruiser. A red light began to blink. His radio, his computer, his entire connection to his own world was now being jammed. He was utterly, completely alone, an island of disgraced authority in a sea of federal power. He watched as Lena pointed down the road, back toward the town he was sworn to protect. She was giving orders, and the tactical agents were listening, nodding and moving to carry them out. He had thought this was his kingdom, but he was just a jester who had stumbled into the court of a king he didn't even know existed. Just as Travis Miller began to think things couldn't possibly get any worse, he heard a familiar sound in the distance. It was a siren, but not the efficient chirp of his own. This was the full-throated, yelping wail of a department in a hurry, the sound Sheriff Dale Bodine used when he wanted to make an entrance. A minute later, a gleaming white Sheriff's Department pickup truck, its own light bar flashing, came roaring down the highway, screeching to a halt just outside the FBI's newly established perimeter. Sheriff Bodine stepped out of the truck. He was a big man, made bigger by a diet of steak and Lone Star beer. His khaki uniform stretched tight over his considerable belly. He had a florid face, a white handlebar mustache, and the unshakable self-assurance of a man who had run the county unopposed for 20 years. He saw Miller standing by his cruiser with his hands on the hood, and his face went purple with rage. "What in the Sam Hill is going on here?" Bodine bellowed, striding towards the nearest tactical agent. "Who the hell are you people? And why is my deputy being detained on my highway?" The agent didn't even turn to face him fully. "Sir, this is a federal crime scene. I'm going to need you to remain behind the perimeter." Bodine was not a man accustomed to being told what to do. He puffed out his chest. "Federal crime scene? I'm the sheriff of this county. There's no crime scene here unless I say there is. Now get out of my way before I arrest you all for obstruction." He tried to push past the agent. It was like trying to push over a statue. The agent didn't move an inch. Instead, Marcus Thorne detached himself from the group and walked over to intercept the sheriff. "Sheriff Bodine," Marcus said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I'm Supervisory Special Agent Marcus Thorne, FBI, and this is most definitely my crime scene." Bodine stopped, his eyes narrowing as he took in Marcus. He saw a black man in a polo shirt, and his mind, like his deputy's, jumped to a familiar, prejudiced conclusion. "FBI my ass," he spat. "You got some ID to prove that?" Without a word, Marcus produced the wallet with the gold shield. He held it open for the sheriff to see. Bodine squinted at it, his bluster faltering for the first time. He'd been sheriff long enough to know a real federal badge when he saw one. His eyes flickered from the badge to Miller, a silent question in his gaze. Miller could only shake his head miserably. "Even if you are a Fed," Bodine said, trying to regain his footing, "you have no jurisdiction here. My deputy made a traffic stop. Whatever it is, it's a local matter." "It stopped being a local matter the moment your deputy violated federal law," Marcus replied coolly. The woman in the business suit, whom Miller now understood to be a federal prosecutor, stepped forward and handed the sheriff a thick sheaf of papers. "Sheriff Bodine," she said, her voice crisp and businesslike, "this is a federal warrant. It authorizes the FBI to conduct a full investigation into the operations of the Culberson County Sheriff's Department, to seize all records, and to secure all facilities. Effective immediately, your department is being placed under federal oversight." Bodine stared at the warrant as if it were a snake. He looked from the warrant to the cold faces of the federal agents, to the impassive tactical team, and finally to his own deputy, who looked like a broken man. The color drained from the sheriff's face. He understood now. This wasn't about a traffic stop. The traffic stop was just the loose thread they had pulled, and his entire world was about to unravel. "On what grounds?" he whispered, his booming voice reduced to a strangled croak. Marcus leaned in slightly. "On the grounds of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and providing material support to a domestic terrorist organization." He paused, letting the words sink in. "We know everything, Sheriff. We know about the Sons of the Alamo. We know about the protection you've been giving them. And thanks to your deputy, we now have you on tape, arriving on scene to interfere with a federal investigation. You came to save your man, Dale. Instead, you just arrested yourself." The term domestic terrorist organization hung in the scorching air, more shocking than any gunshot. Travis Miller felt his knees go weak. The Sons of the Alamo, of course. It all made a horrifying kind of sense now. The Sons were a local militia group, a collection of disgruntled ranchers and conspiracy theorists who spent their weekends in the desert, running drills in camo and talking about government overreach. Miller and the other deputies had always dismissed them as harmless crackpots, playing soldier. Sheriff Bodine, however, treated them differently. He called them patriots and spoke at their meetings. He made sure deputies looked the other way when their trucks were overloaded with suspicious supplies, or when they were caught with illegal firearms. It was just Bodine being Bodine, currying favor with a vocal part of his voter base, or so Miller had thought. A folding table and several chairs appeared from the back of the Suburban, set up with swift precision on the roadside. It became an impromptu command post. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Hannah Vance, spread files across the table. Lena Thorne stood beside her, pointing at maps on a tablet. This was their war room. For the past 6 months, Marcus began, addressing the now cowed Sheriff Bodine, but speaking loud enough for Miller to hear every word. The FBI has been running a joint task force with the ATF investigating the Sons of the Alamo. We identified them not as a militia, but as a domestic terror cell planning to attack a federal energy facility near the state line. They've been stockpiling weapons, building explosives, and conducting surveillance. He paused and looked directly at Bodine. Their base of operations, their primary supply route, is right here in Culberson County. They've been operating under your protection, Sheriff. We have financial records showing regular, unexplained payments into your personal accounts. We have eyewitnesses who will testify that you have actively quashed investigations into the group's activities. We have you on a wiretap from 2 weeks ago, promising their leader that you would keep your deputies away from their convoys on Highway 285. He then turned his gaze on Miller, and the deputy felt like he had been pinned to a board. "You weren't supposed to be here today, Deputy," Marcus said, his voice laced with irony. "You were supposed to be at the other end of the county, handling a bogus call about cattle rustling that your sheriff arranged. But you got bored. You decided to go hunting on your own. You saw my car and your prejudice got the better of you. You stumbled into the one operation in the one place that your boss had explicitly forbidden you from touching. You, Deputy Miller, with your cheap racial profiling, have single-handedly compromised a multi-million-dollar federal investigation and, in doing so, exposed your entire corrupt department." Miller's world imploded. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't even a villain. He was a fool. A pawn who had knocked over the entire chessboard by mistake. His attempt to feel powerful for a few minutes on the side of the road had brought the full weight of the federal government crashing down on everyone, himself included. He had been a loyal soldier for Sheriff Bodine, a man he respected and feared. But that loyalty was a one-way street. Bodine had been using him, using the whole department, as a private security force for a gang of terrorists. The sense of betrayal was so profound, it was nauseating. He looked over at Bodine, whose face was a slack-jawed mask of terror. The big, blustering sheriff was gone, replaced by a scared old man in a tight suit. They were both caught in the same net, and it was a net of their own making. The tactical team faded into the background, maintaining their silent, watchful perimeter as the focus shifted from securing the scene to dismantling the conspiracy. A USA Vance gestured for Sheriff Bodine to sit in one of the folding chairs. He collapsed into it, his face ashen. Another agent brought a second chair and placed it a few feet away, motioning for Travis Miller. His legs moving like lead weights, Miller walked over and sat down. The sun beat down on them, but the heat was nothing compared to the cold, focused glare of the federal officials now surrounding them. This wasn't an interrogation room, but it was far more intimidating. There were no walls to hide behind, only the vast, indifferent Texas landscape and the inescapable truth of their situation. Lena Thorne took the lead with Miller. She pulled up a chair and sat opposite him, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp and analytical. "Deputy Miller," she began, her voice calm and even. "Travis, you're in a very difficult position. You have 2 paths in front of you. One path involves loyalty to a man who sold you out, a man who was using you to protect a terrorist cell. That path ends with you serving a 20 to 30-year sentence in a federal supermax prison for a laundry list of charges, including providing material support for terrorism." She let that sink in. Miller could feel the sweat trickling down his back, cold despite the heat. "The other path," Lena continued, "is cooperation. You were, as my husband stated, a pawn. A deeply prejudiced and incompetent pawn, but a pawn nonetheless. You weren't part of the conspiracy. You were a tool. Tools can sometimes be salvaged. You have a chance, a very small one, to tell us everything you know, to help yourself, to help us understand how deep this corruption goes. The choice is yours. Miller looked over at Bodine. The sheriff wouldn't meet his eyes. He was staring at his own hands, his career, his life, turning to dust between his fingers. There was no help coming from him. There was no loyalty there. Lena was right. He had been used. The anger at the Thorns, the resentment that had fueled the traffic stop was now completely gone, replaced by a burning, helpless rage directed at his boss. Bodine had let him walk into this. He had almost gotten him killed. He told us they were just good old boys, Miller began, his voice cracking. Patriots, he called them. Said the feds were trying to stir up trouble where there wasn't none. He told us to give them space, to handle any calls about them in-house. In-house? Lena prompted. What does that mean? It meant make it go away, Miller admitted, the words spilling out of him now in a desperate torrent. A warning, a citation for something minor, never an arrest, never a search. He had a special list of names, members of the Sons. If we ever ran their plates, we were supposed to clear the call immediately and report it directly to him. Did you ever see them transporting anything? A USA Vance chimed in. Miller nodded miserably. All the time. Covered truck beds, heavy crates. We all figured it was ammo, maybe some guns for their weekend games. We never thought it was bombs. He put his head in his hands, the shame and the terror overwhelming him. He had been a bully and a bigot, but he had always seen himself as a lawman, a protector. To realize he had been the unwitting guard dog for a group of terrorists shattered the last remnants of his identity. He confessed everything. The informal warnings, the quashed reports, the cash bonuses Bodine would hand out at Christmas for loyal service. He painted a picture of a department rotted from the top down, a fiefdom run by a corrupt sheriff who had sold his badge and his county for a few $1,000s and a sense of power. He talked until his throat was raw, a broken man confessing his sins on the side of a highway, hoping for a salvation he knew he didn't deserve. Miller's confession was the final key. While he and Bodine were being formally arrested and placed in the back of separate black SUVs, the full force of the federal task force descended upon Culberson County. The operation, which had been planned for weeks and hinged on subtlety, was now a full-blown hammer strike, executed with overwhelming force and speed. The story unfolded not on the lonely highway, but on screens across the nation. News helicopters that had been pre-positioned in nearby Midland and El Paso scrambled, their cameras capturing stunning images of justice being delivered. The first target was the Culberson County Sheriff's Department itself. A convoy of armored FBI vehicles surrounded the modest building. Tactical agents swarmed inside, herding the shocked deputies into the briefing room. A USA Vance, having left the highway scene, walked in and announced that the department was officially and indefinitely shuttered, its authority suspended, pending a federal investigation. Agents began boxing up files, seizing computers, and collecting badges and weapons from the stunned deputies, many of whom were implicated by Miller's confession. Simultaneously, a second team hit Sheriff Bodine's ranch. The sprawling property, far too extravagant for a small-town sheriff's salary, was revealed to be a secondary storage site for the Sons of the Alamo. News cameras zoomed in as agents pulled military-grade weapons crates and barrels of chemicals from a hidden cellar beneath the barn. The good old boy sheriff was a quartermaster for a terror cell. The main event, however, took place deep in the desert. Guided by the intelligence Marcus Thorne's team had already gathered, and now supplemented by locations Miller had unwillingly provided, a heavily armed FBI SWAT team and ATF SRT converged on the Sons of the Alamo's primary compound. The Patriots were caught completely by surprise. The raid was fast, brutal, and decisive. Drones circled overhead, providing a live feed that was later released to the media. It showed men in camouflage being pulled from bunkers, a makeshift firing range, and a workshop that was a fully functional bomb-making factory. The myth of the harmless militia playing soldier evaporated in the harsh light of day, revealing them as a credible and dangerous domestic threat. The montage of arrests was relentless. The leader of the Sons, a charismatic rancher, was arrested while trying to flee on an ATV. The local judge who had signed off on Bodine's questionable warrants was taken into custody on the golf course. The owner of a trucking company who helped transport the illicit materials was pulled from his office. The web of corruption, so carefully woven in the quiet corners of West Texas, was torn apart in a single afternoon. And through it all, the central image that news channels kept replaying was the initial dashcam footage from Travis Miller's cruiser, which the DOJ had immediately released. The video was a masterclass in prejudice and abuse of power. It showed his sneering condescension, his fabricated claims, and the terrifying moment he reached for his handcuffs. Then, it showed the calm, quiet authority of Marcus Thorne revealing his badge. Travis Miller, in his pathetic attempt to bully a black couple, had become the public face of the very corruption he had unknowingly helped to expose. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a national embarrassment, a symbol of a broken system being cleansed by a swift and righteous federal sword. Months later, the dust in West Texas had settled, but the ground had irrevocably shifted. The Culberson County Sheriff's Department was no more, having been formally disbanded and its duties contracted out to a neighboring county under strict federal supervision. The courthouse had been cleaned out, and the Sons of the Alamo were facing a litany of federal charges that would ensure none of them would see the outside of a prison wall for decades. The story had faded from the national headlines, replaced by new outrages and new dramas. But for the people involved, the echoes of that day on Highway 285 remained. In a federal correctional institution in Bastrop, Travis Miller was no longer Deputy Miller. He was inmate number 75319-081. His trial had been short. With his own dashcam footage as the prosecution's star witness and his confession given on the side of the road, there was little to defend. He pleaded guilty to depriving a citizen of their rights under color of law and received a sentence of 10 years. The terrorism-related charges were dropped in exchange for his full testimony against Bodine and the others. He spent his days in the prison library, surrounded by law books he now understood all too well. He was no longer the tough guy, the hammer. He was a cautionary tale, a ghost haunted by the memory of a gold shield glinting in the sun. In Washington, D.C., Marcus and Lena Thorne stood in a quiet, oak-paneled office at the Department of Justice. The Deputy Attorney General was thanking them, praising their courage and professionalism. The raid had been a resounding success, one of the most significant domestic terror disruptions in recent years. Their work was done, but there was no celebration. For them, it was just another day, another file closed, another threat neutralized. They were the quiet professionals, the invisible guardians who stood on the line not between good and evil, but between order and chaos. Later that evening, sitting in their car in the quiet of a suburban parking garage, Lena turned to Marcus. "Do you ever think about him? Miller?" Marcus stared out the windshield for a long moment, the concrete walls of the garage reflecting the dim light. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I think about how easy it was for him. The hate, the assumption. It was his default setting. He didn't have to think, he just had to feel. And his badge gave him permission to turn that feeling into a weapon." "He was a product of his environment," Lena said, more a statement of fact than an excuse. "We're all products of our environment," Marcus countered. "But we choose what we do with the product. He chose to be a bully. He chose to believe a lie because it made him feel powerful. That's the most dangerous combination in the world, insecurity and authority." He finally turned to look at her, a deep sadness in his eyes. "He almost made me become him. For a second, when he kicked my feet, all I wanted to do was show him what real force looked like. But that's how you lose. Not the fight, but yourself. They drove home in a comfortable silence, another battle won, another war still raging. When we look back at the moment it all began, that single decision by Deputy Travis Miller to flip on his lights, we see the culmination of 1,000 small choices. The foundation for his downfall wasn't laid on the highway. It was laid in years of nursing small grievances, of blaming others for his own stalled life, and of mistaking prejudice for instinct. His anger wasn't truly directed at Marcus and Lena Thorne. It was directed at a world he felt had left him behind. Their calm confidence, their clean car, their very existence was an affront to the narrative of his own victimhood. In his mind, he deserved more, and they, by definition, deserved less. The badge became the tool he used to try and correct that perceived cosmic injustice, to make the world fit his bitter worldview. Could this have gone differently? What if Marcus had simply complied without question, endured the humiliation of a search, and filed a complaint later? Perhaps. But that would have allowed the rot to continue, festering in the dark. What if he had shown his badge sooner, at the first moment of confrontation? It might have de-escalated the situation with Miller, but it would have tipped off Sheriff Bodine and compromised the entire terrorism investigation. The quiet, disciplined path they chose was the only one that allowed justice to be fully served, not just for them, but for the entire community living under a corrupt and dangerous system. Their restraint wasn't weakness. It was a strategic weapon, wielded with more precision and impact than any firearm. The ultimate lesson from that sun-bleached roadside is a sobering one. The systems we build to protect us can so easily be turned into weapons of oppression by the people we entrust to run them. Prejudice is a poison, and when it infects someone with a badge and a gun, it becomes a threat to the very fabric of society. Miller's story is a stark reminder that true authority comes not from the power to command, but from the wisdom to know when to listen, and the character to serve, not to rule. I'm left wondering, what would you have done in Marcus's shoes? Could you have maintained that level of calm and discipline in the face of such blatant disrespect and threat? And what do you think is the most effective way to root out the kind of deep-seated corruption we saw in Culberson County? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective is incredibly valuable. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking and subscribing. Your support allows these stories to be told.